Hi guys, welcome back to Code Master Coach, your medical coding tutor. Guys, today we're continuing our review of the 2025 ICD-10-CM official coding guidelines. Let's start back where we stopped on last week, and we were at chapter 18, Symptoms, Signs, and Abnormal Clinical and Laboratory Findings Not Elsewhere Classified. These codes can be found between R00 through R99. And I just made notes here that just say, remember, if the signs and symptoms lead to a definitive diagnosis, then you do not code the signs and symptoms, just the definitive diagnoses. Also, I made another note. Of course, it's a Code Master Coach note because it's in purple, and it just says SNS stands for signs and symptoms. When I was taking coding classes, when I would see CCs and SSs, I didn't know what they meant. So I wanted to make sure I stressed to you that S and S stands for signs and symptoms. A symptom is what the patient describes. So I put symptom equals patient. Patient describes symptoms to the physician. Where a sign is physician. As patient describes their symptoms to the physician, these symptoms are signs, ding, 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 to the physician of a disease process. So just remember, symptom equals patient, sign equals physician. All right, so we start off by the use of symptom codes. Let's go to our guidelines. And notice it starts off by saying Chapter 18 includes symptoms, signs, abnormal results of clinical or other investigative procedures, and ill-defined conditions regarding which no diagnosis classifiable elsewhere is recorded. Signs and symptoms that point to a specific diagnosis have been assigned to a category in other chapters of the classification. So again, it's just saying, if the signs and symptoms point to a definitive diagnosis, then code it at that definitive diagnosis. All right, we're at A, use of symptoms. Use of symptom codes. Codes that describe symptoms and signs are acceptable for reporting purposes when a related definitive diagnosis has not been established or confirmed by the provider. So if the patient comes in and all they have is a symptom, a headache, and no further studies or no further diagnosis was given by the provider, then that's all that you can code is headache. All right, let's make sure that's all for A. Yep, straight from the guidelines. B, use of symptom codes with a definitive diagnosis. Let's go to the guideline first. Let's look at B. Use of symptom code with a definitive diagnosis code. Codes for signs and symptoms may be reported in addition to a related definitive diagnosis when the sign or symptom is not routinely associated with that diagnosis, such as the various signs and symptoms associated with complex syndromes. The definitive diagnosis code should be sequenced before the symptom code. It says signs or symptoms that are associated routinely with a disease process should not be assigned as additional codes unless otherwise instructed by the classification. So let's see, I had a note there under B. Let's see what my note says. An example of when a symptom code is used with the definitive diagnosis code is at code N40.1 and N40.3. Now again, up to this point, I've stated that if the sign or symptom leads to a definitive diagnosis, don't code the signs and symptoms, just code the definitive diagnosis. However, if the classification tells you to, then you do. So it says the use of symptom codes with the definitive diagnosis. Let's look at N40.1 and N40.3. So I took a scan. If we look at N40.1, benign prostatic hyperplasia with lower urinary tract symptoms, there is a note here that says Use additional code for associated symptoms when specified. So when you're coding this benign prostatic hyperplasia with lower urinary tract and symptoms, and the patient is having urinary frequency, or straining on urination, or nocturia, or even urinary hesitancy, urinary incontinence, urinary obstruction, urinary retention, urinary urgency, or weak urinary stream, it's telling you to use the additional code for these symptoms with this code, N40.1. Same thing at N40.3, nodular prostate with lower urinary tract symptoms. It tells you, there's a note there that says, use additional code for associated symptoms when specified. Incomplete bladder emptying, nocturia, straining on urination, urinary frequency, urinary hesitancy, urinary incontinence, urinary obstruction, urinary retention, and urinary urgency, and even weak urinary stream. If any of those symptoms is documented by your provider along with the diagnoses of nodular prostate with lower urinary tract symptoms, then also assign those symptom codes. Okay? All right, we're down to C, combination codes that include symptoms. So let's see what C says. ICD-10-CM contains a number of combination codes that identify both the definitive diagnoses and common symptoms of that diagnoses. So when using one of these combination codes, an additional code should not be assigned for the symptom. An additional code should not be assigned for the symptom. So let's see if I have a note there for C. Yeah, when they say, for example, fever and malaise due to viral syndrome should only be coded as viral syndrome, because it's understood with viral syndrome, you're going to have fever and malaise. Okay? That's what that guideline is saying. With viral syndrome, B34.9, it's understood the patient's going to have fever and malaise. And it clearly states fever and malaise due to. When I see that due to, I know that's my sign or symptom due to. It led to a definitive diagnosis. Code that definitive diagnosis. All right, we're down to D, repeated falls. Code R29.6, repeated falls, is for use for encounters when a patient has recently fallen and the reason for the fall is being investigated. However, code Z91.81, history of falling, is for the use when a patient has fallen in the past and is at risk for future falls. You know, a lot of times they have fall warnings on patient beds for patients that tend to fall. And so this is when that Z91.81, this patient has a history of falling. And in addition, when it's appropriate, both codes, the repeated falls and the history of, can be assigned together. I don't think I have any notes at D. Nope, straight from the guidelines. All right, let's look at E, coma. E, coma. Code R40.20, unspecified coma, should be assigned when the underlying cause of the coma is not known, or the cause is a traumatic brain injury and the coma scale is not documented in the medical record. So if you just have an unspecified coma, that's R40.20. It says do not report codes for unspecified coma, individual or total Glasgow coma scale scores for a patient with a medically induced coma or a sedated patient. So there is a difference, and you can clearly see it. Medically induced coma is not an unspecified coma, or a sedated patient is not in an unspecified coma state. And there's a scale that can be used. It's called the Coma scale. The Coma scale codes R40.21, and that lets you know there's some more digits, to R40.24 with additional digits, can be used in conjunction with traumatic brain injury codes. These codes cannot be used with code R40.2A for non-traumatic coma due to underlying condition. They are primarily for the use by trauma registries, but they may be used in any setting where this information is collected. The coma scale codes should be sequenced after the diagnoses code. Says these codes, one from each subcategory, are needed to complete the scale. The seventh character indicates when the scale was recorded. The seventh character should match for all three codes. It says, at a minimum, report the initial score documented on presentation at your facility. This may be a score from the emergency medicine technician, such as EMT, or in the emergency department. And if desired, a facility may choose to capture multiple coma scale scores. But assign code R40.24, Glasgow Coma Scale, total score, when only the total score is documented in the medical record and not the individual scores. If multiple coma scores are captured within the first 24 hours after hospital admission, assign only the code for the score at the time of admission. ICD-10-CM does not classify coma scores that are reported after admission but less than 24 hours later. So let's see if I have a note on G. Yeah, the guidelines. The seventh character, my note just says the seventh character indicates when the scale was recorded. Because remember, at the end of that guideline, it says we don't capture those after admission. The seventh character should match for all three of your codes. And I have an example, a scan in here for the R40. Look at 2-1. Your seventh characters are 0 for unspecified time. 1, if it's in the field where the EMT or the ambulance collects it when they pick the patient up. Or 2, at the arrival to the emergency department. 3, at the hospital admission. Or 4, 24 hours or more after hospital admission. And notice that's at R40.21, R40.23, same seventh characters, and R40.24, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So see, now you get to see a seventh character that's not an A, D, or S, initial, subsequent, or sequela, or the others for the fractures. You get to see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And these are with the Glasgow Coma Scale, total scores. Okay? We're down to F on the guidelines. Functional quadriplegia, it says this guideline has been deleted effective October 1st of 2017. So now we're down to G. Just make sure my guidelines are still, yep, guideline deleted. Now we're at G, straight from the guidelines. SIRS, the Systemic Inflammatory Response Syndrome, SIRS, can develop as a result of certain non-infectious disease processes such as trauma, malignant neoplasms, or pancreatitis. Now remember, we're used to seeing SIRS with infection, but it can develop as a result of certain non-infectious disease processes. When SIRS is documented with a non-infectious condition and no subsequent infection is documented, the code for the underlying condition, such as an injury, should be assigned, followed by code R65.10 for systemic inflammatory response syndrome on non-infectious origin without acute organ dysfunction, or code R65.11 systemic inflammatory response syndrome of non-infectious origin with acute organ dysfunction. Now, if an associated acute organ dysfunction is documented, then the appropriate code or codes for the specific type of organ dysfunction should be assigned in addition to code R65.11. And if acute organ dysfunction is documented, but it cannot be determined if the acute organ dysfunction is associated with SIRS or due to another condition, for example, directly due to trauma, then your provider should be queried. We need that specification. We need to know for sure. All right, that's SIRS due to non-infectious process, straight from the guidelines. Now let's look at death not otherwise specified. Death not otherwise specified. Code R99, ill-defined and unknown cause of mortality, is only for use in the very limited circumstances when a patient who has already died is brought into an emergency department or other healthcare facility and is pronounced dead upon arrival. It does not represent the discharge disposition of death. So let me explain that again. With death, when we don't know, think of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. Baby was fine, and then minutes later you go back and the baby is dead in the crib. Sudden infant death, that's an R99 when they don't know what caused the death of the infant. Same thing with other patients that they find at home. If there was no history of any medical condition and we don't know why the patient died, then it's an R99. But it ends this guideline by saying, but it does not represent the discharge disposition of death, because this patient didn't come in and was discharged dead. This patient actually came in dead. There wasn't any further testing or therapeutic treatment or clinical evaluation that can be done because the patient is already deceased. All right? So make sure I have all that for H. Yep, straight from the guidelines. I, the NIHSS stroke scale. The guidelines say the NIH stroke scale, NIHSS, which is codes R29.7 and the rest of your digits, can be used in conjunction with acute stroke codes, the I60 through I63 category, to identify the patient's neurological status and the severity of the stroke. The stroke scale codes should be sequenced after the acute stroke diagnoses codes. So again, the key here is saying make sure as far as those scales, if you're tracking the stroke scale codes, those come after the I60 through I63 category codes. And at a minimum, report the initial score documented. If desired, a facility may choose to capture multiple stroke scale scores, but at a minimum, report just the initial score. Let's make sure my guidelines. Anything else? I just have a note for the stroke scale codes are intended to be used as secondary codes, because remember I said after the I60 through I60. Let me see what the guideline said. It said the I60 through I63 category of codes for stroke. The stroke scale codes are intended to be used as secondary codes, and at a minimum, the medical coder should report the initial score documented. All right, guys, that's chapter 18. I'll be back with chapter 19, which is on injury, poisonings, and certain other consequences of external causes. Thanks, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Don't forget to subscribe. Thanks, guys.